I learned very early that power doesn't announce itself when it is about to change hands. It becomes polite, procedural, almost invisible, because real shifts prefer calm to spectacle. And this story begins during a period everyone later described as uneventful, which is usually how the most consequential moments disguise themselves. Because nothing was burning, no crowds were chanting, no dramatic resignations filled the news. And yet inside the system something fundamental was loosening, not breaking. Just loosening enough to be felt by those who had learned to sense pressure before it became obvious. And I was one of them, close enough to hear the tone change. To notice how certainty faded from conversations that once felt rehearsed, because people had stopped repeating what they were told to believe and started quietly comparing notes. And comparison is the enemy of control, because it replaces obedience with assessment. And assessment invites judgment, and judgment invites choice. And choices are dangerous in systems built on inevitability. And what made this moment especially unstable was that nothing external had forced it. There was no crisis large enough to blame, no shock convenient enough to justify tightening the screws, which meant the instability was internal. Psychological, because belief was thinning. Not disappearing, just thinning enough for doubt to circulate without being punished. And doubt spread silently because it doesn't need permission. And I watched how decision makers began asking questions they would never have asked before. Not publicly, not confrontationally, but sideways, cautiously, as if testing whether uncertainty was now acceptable. And the answers they received were slower, more carefully worded, less absolute. Because authority itself was recalibrating, unsure how much confidence it could still project without inviting scrutiny. And that hesitation created space. And space is where ambition grows. Because ambition does not need chaos, it needs opportunity. And opportunity appears when routines lose their grip, and routines were indeed losing their grip. Approvals took longer, directives contradicted each other. Priorities shifted subtly from outcomes to optics. Because optics by time and time had become the most valuable currency. And I remember the exact moment I realized this wasn't temporary, when someone said, almost casually, "We just need to get through this quarter," and no one asked what came after. Because when systems stop planning beyond the immediate horizon, they are already negotiating with decline. And that negotiation was happening everywhere, quietly, because people were no longer asking how to improve the structure. They were asking how to survive inside it if it changed suddenly. And survival thinking changes behavior fast, because it reframes loyalty as insurance rather than conviction, and insurance is always conditional. And conditional loyalty transforms institutions into marketplaces, where influence is traded for protection and silence is priced higher than competence. And the most unsettling part was how calm it all felt, because panic would have triggered correction, but calm allowed erosion to continue unnoticed. And erosion is patient, it does not rush. It waits for people to normalize it, and normalization happened quickly. Because humans adapt faster than systems can reform, and as adaptation spread, expectations lowered, ambitions narrowed, and people began acting as if continuity was the goal rather than progress, because continuity feels safer when direction is unclear. And that shift marked the real beginning of the story. Not a dramatic confrontation, but a collective adjustment. A silent agreement to tolerate less, as long as things didn't fall apart. And that tolerance created imbalance, because those who benefited from the adjustment moved faster, consolidated quietly, positioned themselves near the remaining levers of influence, while those who lost ground hesitated, unsure whether resistance was still possible or already too risky. And hesitation, once widespread, becomes structural, because it embeds itself into process, into culture, into how decisions are framed. And I saw how language changed to accommodate it. How words like temporary, review, and reassessment became shields against accountability, because shields are useful when no one is ready to commit. And commitment had become rare, because commitment implies belief in an outcome, and belief was the one thing no longer shared. And this is why the first chapter ends not with an action, but with a condition, a system still functioning, still orderly, still intact. but quietly preparing for something it refused to define. Because defining it would force alignment too early, and early alignment would expose who was ready and who wasn't, and exposure was dangerous now. Because danger no longer came from opposition, but from miscalculation. And the most dangerous miscalculation is assuming that nothing is happening just because nothing is visible. Because invisibility is often the final stage before momentum returns suddenly, violently, and without warning, and in the next chapter. I'll tell you about the first decision that crossed the line from adjustment to commitment. The one that seemed minor at the time but forced everyone inside the system to choose whether they were still waiting or already moving. The decision that crossed the line did not arrive with urgency or drama, and that was precisely what made it irreversible. Because urgency invites reconsideration while calm normalizes consequence. And when it was announced, it sounded reasonable, almost boring, framed as a technical adjustment meant to stabilize rather than transform. And I remember how people nodded automatically, not because they agreed, but because disagreement felt strangely inappropriate, as if questioning the decision itself would have revealed something they were not yet ready to show. And that hesitation, that collective pause before reaction, told me everything I needed to know, because it meant the system had reached a point where compliance was no longer driven by belief, but by calculation. And calculation is colder, more durable, and far more dangerous, because it does not require loyalty, only alignment, and alignment can be temporary, opportunistic, and strategic, and once alignment replaces conviction, every move becomes a test of positioning rather than purpose. And this move was exactly that, a positioning device disguised as maintenance, because it quietly reallocated authority, shifted oversight, and narrowed the number of people who mattered without explicitly announcing exclusion. An exclusion that is not named is the most effective kind, because it leaves no grievance to rally around. Only absence, and absence forces adaptation. And I watched as people adapted quickly, some leaning in, some stepping back, some pretending nothing had changed while privately recalibrating their exposure. Because once a system signals that protections are conditional, everyone begins renegotiating their relationship to it. And renegotiation spreads invisibly because it happens in private conversations, in delayed responses, in subtle changes of tone. And what made this moment especially volatile was that it occurred without a crisis large enough to justify it publicly, which meant the justification had to be internal, psychological. Because systems can survive unpopular decisions if they feel necessary, but they struggle when necessity is ambiguous, and ambiguity was everywhere now. Because no one could say with confidence whether this was a one-time adjustment or the beginning of something permanent. And permanence is what people fear most, because permanence demands commitment. And commitment in uncertain systems is expensive. And that fear began shaping behavior almost immediately. Because people started asking different questions, not "is this right?" or "will this work?" but "where does this leave me?" and "who benefits if this continues?" And those questions fracture collective direction, because they shift focus from outcomes to advantage, and advantage seeking is corrosive in institutions built on shared purpose, because it encourages competition rather than coordination. And competition inside a closed system does not produce innovation, it produces concealment, because information becomes leverage, and leverage is power. And power hoarded internally weakens the structure as a whole. And I saw how information flow slowed, not because people stopped knowing things, but because they stopped sharing them freely. And when information becomes transactional, trust collapses quietly, because trust depends on predictability. And predictability disappears when everyone is optimizing for personal risk rather than collective success. And the system responded to this by tightening further, not deliberately, not maliciously, but instinctively. Because systems under stress default to control, and control reduces variables. And reducing variables feels safer even when it introduces new risks. And this tightening was subtle at first, approvals requiring extra signatures, decisions framed as temporary holds, authority justified through process rather than outcome. Because process feels neutral, and neutrality is persuasive when no one wants to be seen as ambitious too early. And ambition had indeed become dangerous, because ambition implies readiness to act. And acting now meant exposure, and exposure invited scrutiny. And scrutiny in a recalibrating system is rarely rewarded. And so people waited, but waiting did not mean inactivity. It meant preparation, because waiting with intention is the most underestimated form of movement. And people prepared quietly, strengthening networks outside formal channels, securing alternatives, reinforcing loyalties that did not depend on the current configuration. Because everyone understood, even if they never said it aloud, that the system was no longer expanding, it was contracting. And contraction changes incentives fundamentally, because when there is less to go around, collaboration becomes riskier, and competition more rational. And rational competition produces winners quickly, but stability rarely. And the move had also done something else, something deeply destabilizing. It had demonstrated that authority could be exercised without consensus and survival validates method. Because once a tactic works, it becomes precedent. And precedent shapes expectation, and expectation shapes behavior, and behavior becomes culture. And culture is far harder to reverse than policy. And I remember thinking that this was the true danger. Not the decision itself, but what it taught everyone watching, that lines could be crossed quietly. That power no longer needed to persuade if it could manage reaction, and reaction had been muted. Not because people agreed, but because they were still assessing the risk of dissent. And risk assessment takes time, and time buys consolidation. And consolidation reduces options, and reduced options raise the cost of resistance. And this loop fed on itself relentlessly because each day without pushback made the next day's pushback less likely. And the silence was misread as acceptance, and acceptance was treated as validation. And validation emboldened further narrowing. Because once power believes it can act without consequence, it tests that belief incrementally, and each successful test lowers the threshold for the next. And the system moved through those thresholds with alarming smoothness. Because everyone was still behaving politely, professionally, as if decorum could substitute for consensus, and decorum is seductive. Because it allows conflict to exist without appearing. And appearing is what forces resolution. And resolution was exactly what no one wanted yet. Because resolution would require choosing sides before the outcome was clear, and clarity had become dangerous. Because clarity attracts commitment, and commitment limits flexibility. And flexibility was now the most valuable asset anyone could have because the future was no longer linear. It was branching, and branches demand optionality. And optionality demands silence, and silence dominated this phase. A silence filled with calculation, contingency planning, and quiet alliances that were never formalized but deeply felt. And the system sensed this undercurrent even if it could not map it precisely. Because systems feel tension before they understand it. And feeling tension triggered further consolidation, because consolidation is the only response control-oriented systems know how to execute under uncertainty. And this acceleration toward concentration created momentum that was difficult to stop. Because stopping would have signaled doubt, and doubt was the one thing authority could no longer afford to display openly. And so it pressed forward, issuing clarifications that clarified nothing. Reaffirming commitments that no one felt secure relying on, because words lose power when they are used to manage perception rather than reality. And reality was shifting faster than language could keep up. And the most unsettling realization for me during this period was that everyone believed they were being cautious, reasonable, pragmatic, when in fact they were collectively participating in escalation. Because escalation does not always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks careful, measured, incremental. And that makes it harder to resist, because resistance feels disproportionate until it is too late. And by the time anyone could point to a single moment where things had clearly changed, the change had already embedded itself into routines, expectations, and informal rules. And reversing it would have required a level of coordination and trust that no longer existed. Because trust had been traded away gradually for flexibility. And flexibility had been used to secure position rather than rebuild cohesion. And that is why the second chapter ends here. Not with collapse or confrontation, but with commitment. Because the system had committed itself to a path without formally acknowledging it. And commitment without acknowledgement is the most dangerous kind, because it denies responsibility while enforcing consequence. And from this point on, every move would be interpreted through the lens of survival rather than reform. And survival thinking rarely produces outcomes that feel humane or stable in the long run. And in the next chapter, I'll tell you about the moment when this quiet commitment encountered resistance for the first time. Not loud resistance, not heroic resistance, but a refusal so precise and limited that it exposed just how narrow the system's margin for error had become. Because once that refusal occurred, everything that had been calculated in silence would be forced into the open, and there would be no returning to the comfort of ambiguity again. The refusal did not announce itself as defiance, which is why it could not be dismissed as rebellion, because it was framed as compliance taken to its logical extreme, an action that followed the rules so precisely that it exposed how fragile those rules had become. And when it happened, the reaction was confusion rather than outrage. Because confusion is what emerges when authority expects resistance and instead encounters limits. And limits are unsettling because they cannot be shouted down or punished icily without revealing insecurity. And I remember how quickly the atmosphere changed after that moment. How conversations stopped revolving around what could be done next and started circling around what could no longer be done safely. Because the refusal had narrowed the field dramatically, not by challenging power head-on, but by demonstrating that momentum alone was no longer sufficient to carry decisions forward. And momentum without consent becomes friction. And friction generates heat, and heat attracts attention. And attention was the one thing everyone had been trying to avoid, because attention forces alignment. And alignment exposes positions, and positions carry consequences. And the system responded instinctively by attempting to reassert normality, issuing clarifications, emphasizing continuity, reminding everyone that nothing fundamental had changed. But the problem was that something had changed. Not structurally yet, but psychologically. Because the refusal had planted a dangerous idea. That inevitability was conditional, and once inevitability becomes conditional, power must negotiate rather than assume, and negotiation is exhausting in systems built for command, because it requires listening, adaptation, and compromise. All of which feel like weakness when survival has been framed as the ultimate objective. And I saw how that exhaustion spread unevenly. How some doubled down, insisting on tighter control, faster decisions, harsher boundaries, while others began quietly disengaging, complying on paper while withdrawing commitment in practice, because disengagement is safer than opposition when outcomes are uncertain. And uncertainty was now everywhere, not loud enough to cause panic, but persistent enough to shape behavior. And that persistence mattered more than any single event, because it altered incentives subtly, encouraging caution over initiative, silence over candor, maintenance over vision. And systems can endure a long time in maintenance mode, but they cannot renew themselves there, because renewal requires risk. And risk had become synonymous with vulnerability, and vulnerability was unacceptable. And so the structure settled into a holding pattern, one that appeared stable from the outside but felt tense from within, because everyone sensed that the margin for error had thinned, that mistakes would now carry disproportionate consequences. And when error becomes intolerable, creativity disappears, because creativity produces variation, and variation introduces unpredictability. And unpredictability is the enemy of control. And the irony was that the strategies designed to eliminate unpredictability were themselves creating it. Because by narrowing options too far, the system made itself dependent on perfect execution. And perfect execution is impossible over time. And I watched how people adapted to this reality by lowering expectations, redefining success as avoidance of failure rather than achievement. Because avoidance feels safer when futures are unclear. And that redefinition was the quiet ending of something important, because it marked the point where ambition gave way to endurance as the dominant value. And endurance can sustain a system, but it cannot inspire it. And inspiration is what carries societies forward when circumstances are difficult. And without it, fatigue accumulates invisibly. Because fatigue is not dramatic, it does not explode, it settles. And settled fatigue reshapes behavior more effectively than fear ever could. And by the time this fatigue became noticeable, it was already normalized, embedded into routines, accepted as the cost of stability, and that acceptance was perhaps the most consequential outcome of all. Because once people accept limitation as permanent, power no longer needs to justify itself extensively. It only needs to persist, and persistence became the primary metric. Not improvement, not legitimacy, not even broad support, just continuity. And continuity is persuasive when alternatives feel risky. And risky was how everything outside the holding pattern now felt. And I realized then that the story was not ending with a decisive victory or a dramatic failure, but with entrenchment. Because entrenchment is what happens when systems survive their crises without resolving the tensions that caused them. An unresolved tension hardens into structure, shaping future decisions long after the original context has faded. And that is why the ending feels quiet rather than conclusive. Because nothing formally ended, nothing was declared finished. The system simply adjusted to a narrower future and began calling it normal. And those inside adjusted with it, recalibrating their lives' ambitions and expectations to fit within what now felt possible. Impossibility itself became constrained, not by law or force alone, but by habit. By the repeated choice to avoid risk, to postpone reckoning, to prioritize stability over transformation, and those choices compounded because habits shape culture. And culture shapes outcomes more persistently than any decree. And as I look back on how this unfolded, the lesson that stands out is not about any single decision or actor, but about the cost of choosing control as an end rather than a means, because control can secure survival. But when survival becomes the sole objective, the future is quietly mortgaged. And that mortgage does not come due all at once. It is paid gradually in lost momentum and deferred renewal, in a collective settling for less as long as things do not fall apart. And that is where this story ends, not with collapse or resolution, but with a system that endured by narrowing itself, that maintained order by sacrificing openness, and that preserved stability by redefining what stability meant. And whether that choice ultimately prevented greater harm or merely delayed a deeper reckoning is a question history will continue to ask. But what is certain is that once a system adapts to crisis by hardening rather than evolving, it rarely returns to what it was before, because survival changes priorities permanently, and the quietest endings are often the ones that last the longest.